Today we're looking at a video called Debunking the Myths, Answering Objections to the Cosmological Argument. So that's kind of nice. We're not just going to hear the cosmological argument again. We're going one step further than that.
Hello, saints and scholars.
Hello. I see you're using the snowball. That's the mic I used to use. There's a reason my old videos sound the way they sound. Well, it was the mic and incompetence.
Welcome back to Theolife, where today we're going to address potential objections to the cosmological argument.
Okay, why are you doing it in your kid's bedroom? No space in the rest of the house, or?
While the evidence for this non-contingent being we call God is very compelling...
I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding this. Why are you speaking to me like I'm a child? Why are you doing the bodily equivalent of jangling keys? No children are watching a video on this topic.
It is not absolute in some people's minds. Sometimes these conversations are fun and civil.
Now there's a cartoon. This is starting to remind me of Dr. O. Remember that series? Nobody remembers that series. It's one of my least viewed series that I ever made, but I liked it. That guy was doing the same thing, theming everything around children's stuff, toys, cartoons, whatever. Talking in that voice that kids don't like, think kids like, and yet talking about arguments that are really only going to be of interest to at least teenagers. I can only assume it's a spectacular misunderstanding of how to market to your demographic, maybe even of who your demo is.
Sometimes they're not so much.
Wrong, wrong, wrong.
Yeah, I'm not including 11 seconds of an unfunny clip from an unfunny sitcom to get copyright claimed on.
If you want to see an example of the non-civil kind of argument, check out the comments section of this video.
I read through the comments you showed. Some of them are a little blunt, a little snarky. Nothing especially bad, though. Nothing where I would start complaining about incivility. I'm sorry, but you're dealing with the masses. We're not all going to speak with the perfect formal politeness of a well-heeled Victorian.
Non-Christians have some very valid questions when it comes to any piece of evidence for the Christian faith. It's not enough just to know the positive arguments, you also have to be prepared for the negative arguments and how to give a proper response.
I appreciate that message. I think that's a very, very helpful thing to be communicating to your fellow Christians, because it is overlooked a lot. A lot of Christians really don't seem to have any grasp on the counter-arguments at all, and just keep on putting forth the same old arguments, expecting, I guess, that they'll just magically work this time, like uttering a spell. Obviously, that's not universal, but it is really common. So it's nice to hear that being directly addressed.
So today, we're going to address the three most common objections to the cosmological argument. Objection number 1. Who created God?
Yeah, I agree that if it's presented just like that with nothing else, it does leave something to be desired. The bigger issue is why we can treat God in a certain way just on our say-so, but we can't treat other things the same way just on our say-so. But I guess you're getting to that.
If everything requires a cause, then what caused God?
Well, obviously that wouldn't address the argument, because the argument is not that everything requires a cause. It's that things that begin to exist have a cause. And the real problem is not so much about what created God, because God is conceptually defined as just not having been created. The much bigger question is, why can the Christian just bluntly declare that physical reality began to exist, a claim for which we have no evidence, and that God just didn't? It's just saying things. And if the Christian can just say physical reality began to exist and God did not, then anyone else can also say physical reality did not begin to exist, which in my opinion is actually superior, because it posits fewer entities, and those it does posit are ones that we already know exist. Now, I know I'm probably jumping the gun with that. You're probably going to get to that, and I'm sorry about that. But I think you're kind of jumping the gun as well, because you're talking about the objections to the argument, you're talking about all this stuff about it, without talking about the argument at all so far. But later in the video you do, and I think that it's really best if I front load this video a bit by showing that argument, going through it, figuring out how the terms in the argument would need to be interpreted to support anything close to what you want to support with it, and explaining some of the problems that I personally have with it that prevent me personally from seeing it as compelling to me, and what I think would need to be improved for it to be effective in this application. If I don't do any of that up front, this whole video is going to be a little bit unclear as to why I'm arguing with you, what we're arguing about, why I phrase things the specific way that I do, or why I object in a certain way to certain things. On my first pass through this video, that's the way I did it. and it was chaos. It was a mess. So I'm reformatting it a little bit, sticking all this stuff here up front, and video creator guy, if you want to watch this, I think this will make it much easier for you to understand which objections would need to be overcome to convince someone like me, and why your attempts to overcome the objections that you bring up in this video don't work for me. So to start with, here's your slide showing the argument. This is from later in the video, I'm just bringing it up here because it's more useful here. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Seems pretty simple at a glance, which is why it has such a broad appeal. It's catchy, it's simple, it's easy to remember, anyone can see that it has a valid structure. It seems unambiguous, and the premises intuitively feel correct and like they should be uncontroversial. The fact that it doesn't end with therefore God is a point against it, but that can be dealt with later, right? Unfortunately, though, I just don't see the simplicity and beauty in this argument that the Christians who use it apparently see. The most simplistic way to interpret the words in the conclusion would be that space-time as we know it had a starting point at the start of the Big Bang, and that the Big Bang had to occur for some reason. Which, okay, we can take a simplistic view of the universe and say that's space-time, and we can take a simplistic view of how time works, and say that in some meaningful way the time flow of the universe began there. But if that's all it is, I would still lean towards the cause being physical. But that already causes a problem because there's still no meaningful sense that I can discern in which the fundamental physical reality of what the universe is began to exist at that point, and I'll explain why. Here's an explanation of the Kalam cosmological argument written by William Lane Craig, the guy responsible for the fact that you're using it right now. He shows this picture to explain the idea of there being nothing before the start of time. He's pointing to the point of the cone to show why it makes no sense to talk about there being more point beyond the point, or more time beyond the start of time. Now, yes, sure, very possibly space-time has a geometry such that there is no space-time beyond the point of that cone. Obviously, the cone is very much a simplification, but it works for illustration purposes. But the way this is depicted says a lot, I think. Now, the way Craig describes this is we can portray our three-dimensional space as a two-dimensional disk which shrinks as you go back in time. So, based on the way this is depicted, all points in time and space exist at some place within the volume of this three-dimensional cone. As Craig says, space-time thus has the geometry of a cone. In other words, time can be thought of as just an aspect of the geometry of the universe. So if we imagine space-time as a cone, then when we focus on the point, the beginning, the rest of the cone is still there. There's no point in this drawing where the cone itself does not exist. The point at the tip of the cone is just one of many points, which exist at distances relative to each other, and are all part of one unified whole. Otherwise, this cone would not exist. What would exist is only one infinitely thin slice of the cone, a two-dimensional ellipse, which is changing over time. But that's not how it's depicted. So I'm going to go by how it is depicted, which shows the point being part of the cone, part of its overall geometry. Craig says that the universe comprises all contiguous space-time reality. In other words, the universe does not exist at some point within space-time reality, because it is space-time reality. All points in time are included in what the universe is, always. If space-time is thought of as the geometry of the universe, it simply makes zero sense to talk about a point outside that geometry as though it were within it. The start of time is just a point on the cone, and there was no before the start of time. And since time, being an aspect of space-time, is part of the cone itself, which is space-time, to speak of the cone itself coming into being, which is a time-based concept, is to posit some kind of super time, some higher dimensional geometrical analog to time, within which time itself could at some points exist and at some points not exist, hyper-chronologically. This is weird and there's nothing to indicate this. The idea posited by Craig that the universe, all contiguous space-time reality, began to exist is to me not very meaningful. In the framework he presents, it seems to me much simpler to consider that the cone just is, and the start of time is just the point that happens to be at its tip. Now, obviously, this view involves some ideas about the nature of time. It's a very B-theory kind of view, where the flow of time is an illusion, there's no definite present, the future always exists, a block universe, essentially. And this is less intuitive than A-theory approaches, where the future does not yet exist, and it's constantly being created or moved into, in which things either happen in an eternally changing, pastless present, or as a present at the forefront of a growing block universe that continually constructs a past as the timeline grows. And these A-type ideas are really intuitive for most people because they line up better with how time feels to humans, that we're always advancing into a new present that's actively happening. But personally, I find that the B approach makes more sense. Christian theology seems to like to mix these up, with the A view being taken as generally obvious. The universe has a very clear beginning, and time clearly progresses, and then they start talking about their timeless transcendent God who's observing what apparently is a B-theory non-growing block universe, where all of the past, present, and future is simultaneously observable. I think that's a little bit silly, but I don't know what the right answer is here. Our intuitions and ideas on this subject mean little to nothing. You and I, at least, really don't know anything meaningful about the reality of time. When I talk about Craig's diagram, I'm just talking about it as if how he drew it is how he meant it. If he actually means that the cone actually at some time did not exist at all, and then the point came into existence ex nihilo and started growing, I think he should have made that clear. But in my view, it makes the most sense that at the very least, the point would have existed at the beginning as some original space-time form, not that space-time wasn't there at all and just originated from nothing. Now, what Craig exactly meant is not important. How time works exactly is not important. My point is only this. If I'm to take the Kalam cosmological argument to indicate some beginning that requires a cause, then it cannot just be taken so simplistically as to refer to space-time coming to a point at some distance in the past. I would need the claim to be that in some way, all contiguous space-time reality, as Craig puts it, can fail to exist at all. That somehow, in some way that I have to refer to in the past tense because there is no adequate grammatical tense to refer to things that happened beyond time, it did fail to exist in a non-past past until it was caused, whatever that's even supposed to mean in this context. Honestly, I barely even understand the claim. I don't really see how I'm supposed to believe it. Christians usually believe that before the universe there was nothing physical, only a non-physical God. Then God created the universe ex nihilo out of nothing, and then there was a non-physical God and a physical universe. In this case, the universe is synonymous with everything that is physical. And I think that definition would close off a few possibly annoying loose ends once we agree that it did begin to exist. If we define the universe strictly only in terms of space-time, then we're unhelpfully left with the escape route of non-space-time physical reality. I don't know if that's a thing, I'm just saying we could conceive of it, and it's better if we close off that possibility. When Christians say the universe began to exist, they don't seem to mean space-time as we know it began to exist, but there was some other weird aspect of physical reality which always existed and which also caused space-time to exist. No. When they use the cosmological argument, they're trying to talk about an origin of physical reality in its entirety. It's basically a fancy way of saying, why is there something rather than nothing? And I think this is why Craig tries to be so clear about what he means by there being nothing before the point of the cone. He says, notice that there's simply nothing prior to the initial boundary of space-time. Let's not be misled by words. When cosmologists say there is nothing prior to the initial boundary, they do not mean that there is some state of affairs prior to it and that is a state of nothingness. That would be to treat nothing as though it were something. Rather, they mean that at the boundary point it is false, that there is something prior to this point. So in other words, there is no time before the universe when the universe did not exist. There is no state of things in which there is no universe. There is no time in which there could have been no space-time. To talk about it as if it did not exist misses the point of what it is for it to exist. But this is what we have to establish for the cosmological argument to mean something to me. That in some timeless sense there was a time-ish where nothing physical existed, and then, if that word means anything in this context, it did exist. I don't get it. But yeah, so since we're talking about the origin of all of physical reality, let's just use that term. When we say the universe, we mean it in the broad sense of just everything physical. Since you're a Christian, I think you'll find that very acceptable. That's already what you think, presumably. And that's kind of what I need it to mean to find the argument convincing the way you'd like me to. So for clarity, I'm just going to call it physical reality for the rest of the video.
By saying God did it, you're merely adding another step to the chain of causes. This is merely the fallacy of kicking the can down the road. Fallacy of kicking the can down the road is taking another unnecessary step to avoid a challenging issue. It's a temporary explanation that doesn't create a full argument.
I've never heard of this fallacy before. Did you make that up? But your description of it is pretty accurate to what we're talking about. Regardless of whether anything created God or not, that's what's happening. You already have this one thing, physical reality. You know that's there, but you don't know if there was some point in time at which that did not exist. This argument relies on essentially just declaring that physical reality must have had an origin, because it would be challenging to think of it otherwise, maybe, and then taking the unnecessary step of adding an unnecessary entity prior to physical reality, and declaring that just gets to not have an origin. Which, if the problem in the first place was you found it difficult to think of physical reality not having an origin, this does nothing to resolve it, because now you have another thing that you think doesn't have an origin, which should present you with the exact same level of challenge, which is essentially what the who created God thing is a shorthand for. Maybe don't take it so literally, but it is pointing at a real concern.
To which we can respond, in this instance, God would actually be a non-contingent being, so himself would not require a cause. The argument for causality only applies to contingent beings.
Right, but you could have just said that about physical reality. If you can just say that with God, you can just say that with physical reality, and spare yourself the can kicking. If you can't do that with physical reality, then there's no reason you can do it with God. And therefore you've delegitimized your applying this concept to God, thus making it entirely fair to ask the question, okay, then where did God come from? You're trying to engage in special pleading. You're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You got two prongs on your fork and you're trying to pick the middle one.
For example, the Cosmological argument states whatever begins to exist has a cause, and we would state that God did not begin to exist, therefore would not need a cause to explain himself.
Cool, I don't think physical reality began to exist. There's zero evidence of that. That's just something people assume because they want a space for God to fit in. And just like everyone else on the planet, you have nothing in support of that. All you have is a sort of instinct based on your perception of causation that you acquire from like dropping eggs on the floor in your entropic little perception of a time stream, which is not the kind of thing we're talking about. That's existing stuff changing form. That has nothing to do with physical reality coming into existence. And now he goes off rambling about this same topic for an extended period of time, giving an analogy about how the foundation can exist without the house, but the house can't exist without the foundation, the house being the contingent things and the foundation being non-contingent. I kind of like the analogy, considering that the foundation is physical.
This is also an opportunity to get into some exciting theology.
Ah, an oxymoron.
Throughout the Bible, God is described in this glorious word which means I am. Out of respect for our Jewish listeners, I won't use the name of God itself.
You mean Yahweh? You just showed it on the screen, man. There are Orthodox Jews out there who will find that disrespectful too. But you know, this idea that you should show respect by following rules of religions you're not part of is very weird to me. What's next? Are you going to stop eating bacon cheeseburgers to show more respect to Jews and Hindus? How far are you going to take this? Doesn't make any sense. It's better to just say follow your own religion and I'll do my thing.
But I'll use the replacement word Hashem. There are two elements to God's name that will help us understand this argument better. First, God is timeless, and two, God is not dependent upon others for his existence.
That sounds an awful lot like how I think of physical reality. You're saying all this to address this accusation that you brought up to yourself, that you're adding an unnecessary extra step, but you're still just engaging in the same behavior. Now you're trying to, what? Defend adding an unnecessary extra step because of the name Jews gave to God, which somehow justifies the special pleading that you're trying to use to justify adding the extra step unnecessarily? You're wasting time on all of this, finding some way to justify pointless extra steps to avoid addressing the actual issue that seems challenging to you, which is exactly the definition you gave of the kicking the can down the road fallacy.
Hashem is always referred to as I am. His name is...
Oh my god, the sudden mirroring of the image freaked me out. I could physically feel my brain trying to jump out of my head. This is a very unpleasant feeling.
Always given in the present tense. He is never referred to as I was or I might be in the future. future. In fact, when Jesus himself uses this term to describe himself, he gives the interesting phrase, "Before Abraham was, I am."
Okay, does this have anything to do with anything? What function is this serving? I don't understand what this has to do with addressing atheist objections to the cosmological argument. I think God was always there, and he has a name that means that. Cool, good, short and sweet, I got you. Doesn't do a lot for me, but okay, I get your point.
Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am."
God's giving himself the title, but using it in a very interesting structure. Jesus referred to himself in the present tense for a historical event. This is interesting because only a being who is outside of time can refer to themselves always in the present tense.
No, anyone can do that. It might be seen as grammatically questionable, but you can definitely craft a grammatically questionable sentence. How is this supposed to respond to atheist objections? Jesus used an interesting name in an interesting way. Wow, I never saw anyone do anything interesting before. What are you hoping to accomplish with this?
Unlike us linear beings who have a past, present, and future, God can see the entirety of the beginning of time and the end of time as one clear view.
Right, so again, Christianity has a B theory of time from the perspective of God. Past, present, and future all exist. No particular present is privileged. And the start of time isn't anything special. It's just another point in space-time. It's the point of William Lane Craig's cone. And the rest of the cone already exists. No matter which time you focus on, all other times are always there. So even in your view, talking about the universe beginning to exist at the beginning of time doesn't make any sense. At the beginning, the end is already there for God to look at. The origin of a universe which includes time is not an event in time. Time is part of what originated. And so again, you're going to have to make this make sense for the cosmological argument to make sense.
Therefore, God can always refer to himself in the present tense, whatever moment he is in, therefore showing himself to be a timeless being and an uncaused being without a beginning, therefore not requiring an explanation.
Yeah, but again, I'm an atheist. I don't think God referred to himself. Not in this way or in any other way. Yes, I get it. You think God is timeless, and you think God always existed, and you think God is non-contingent. That's awesome. Telling me what God's name is in the Bible, or how Jesus refers to himself, neither clarifies the point nor supports it. Not that it needs support. If that's how you define God, that's how you define God. That's fine. We can start with that. Just tell me what you think. But the conversation is not just going to end once you provide a definition of God. The issues that arise when you try to engage in the kind of special pleading that is implicit in the cosmological argument, the inconsistent standards which, when applied consistently, lead naturally to questions like, where did God come from then, are not a function of a misunderstanding of the definition. The issue is not just going to vanish when your opponent understands your position better. By the end of your rambling here, you will have wasted more than half of your video addressing something entirely tangential to the actual objection, without in any way actually defending your position. This is not that great of a strategy.
The next concept we see in the term Hashem is that God is not dependent upon anyone else. Yet in the term Hashem, I am that I am, God does not define himself by his relationship to his accomplishments or his connections with other people. In the foundation of his name is the idea that God is fundamentally self-reliant. My name is Reverend Patrick John Stitt, BAMA. The Reverend shows that I'm associated with the Assembly of God as an ordained minister.
The name Patrick comes from my maternal grandfather, and John coming from my paternal grandfather, and the term Stitt being the name of my family or clan. The letters after my name represents my qualifications in certain arenas.
So every element of me is defined by my relationship to other communities.
Okay, that sounds like a choice. Is the reality of you modified by the name you go by? Like the name actually changes what you are, not just what you call yourself?
We find the exact opposite in the name of God. I am that I am is a statement that he is not defined by community and not defined by accomplishment.
What if my kid decides when she's older to go and get her name changed to Yahweh? Does she turn into a transcendent, timeless, non-dependent being? I mean, that's essentially the claim. God calls himself this. Jesus calls himself this. Therefore, it's true. I go by a name that implies some sort of connections to people and events in the world, and that means I have those connections in actual fact. If you changed your name to the name of somebody else's grandfather, would that make that person's grandfather your new grandfather? Is that how names work? If that's not what you mean, then why are you even bothering to talk about it? It has nothing to do with the conversation.
He is entirely self-reliant, therefore being the ultimate uncaused, unmoved mover, and uncontingent being.
So the book says he goes by the name Yahweh, therefore he is, in fact, this, that, and the other thing. What is the logical connection between you're called X, therefore you are Y? You didn't say anything about how you got from one to the other, so it seems like you just took a big leap. But yes, I've got you. You believe things about God. I know. How is that supposed to address the special pleading problem of the cosmological argument? Well, I can only assume it's not. That the answer is just to fill time and hope that if you fill enough time talking about stuff you think sounds smart, that people think you addressed the issue that you're ignoring.
Whoa! Wow, that's some good theology.
Please never do that again. And no, it's not good theology or good anything. It's utterly pointless drivel. I don't know why you spent so long on that, or frankly, why I even bothered going through it. I don't need to pad this video out. I genuinely have no idea why I even bothered with that.
It's like God set up his name for great apologetic arguments.
How was that even apologetics? What position would you even be defending that you didn't already deal with? You already did the God is non-contingent stuff before this, so what's left? God is in the Bible? God refers to himself in the present tense? It's completely empty. You wasted so much time accomplishing literally nothing.
So with sound logic and good theology, you can provide a great answer for the question, who created God?
Look, I understand, just to be clear before we move on here, that just straight up asking, but who created God, can be a little bit flippant, or at least come off that way. And if it is meant to drive at the kind of issues I've been discussing, it is sort of a clumsy way to do it. But you said at the start that you have to be prepared for the negative arguments and how to give a proper response to them, and it doesn't really seem like you are that prepared. It doesn't really seem like you even get the point. You're spending too much time playing with your He-Mans and your Ninja Turtles Technodrome and not enough time listening.
Objection number 2 is the timeless universe. Foundation to the cosmological argument is that the universe had a beginning.
Yes, but it's rarely appreciated what that actually means. It's often pointed to that, look, Big Bang cosmology implies that the universe was very, very small and dense. It was a point, and then it expanded outwards, so that's the beginning. Except, no, Big Bang cosmology does not posit that physical reality itself began at that point. But of course, for it to work for the Kalam cosmological argument, that would have to be the case. Because this is supposed to be when God created all of physical reality ex nihilo, out of nothing. I am sorry, but this is a purely 100% unsupported assertion. The only way that it could be seen otherwise is if you just kind of believe already that that's how things are. Maybe from a pre-existing religious commitment or assumptions that seem compelling from within the human context where, in fact, nothing ever has been observed to originate in this way, despite us feeling inaccurately that we have seen something similar. We've never seen anything like what's being proposed and treated as obvious. All energy and space-time and whatever more fundamental concepts there are, physically, just coming into existence from literally nothing. We have the first law of thermodynamics because we've never seen this, because there's no evidence for this, and in fact, as far as we can tell, it seems a lot like an impossibility. When we think of things having an origin, that's not what we're thinking of. We're thinking of pre-existing matter and energy being reconfigured. Nothing like what's proposed in the Kalam cosmological argument, and necessary for it to work as an argument, has ever been observed. Nothing even similar to it.
If the universe had a beginning, then the universe had a cause. And if the universe had a cause, it had a causer. This has led some people to question, did the universe even have a beginning?
Wrong answer.
That's not an answer, Patrick, it's a question. And a very legitimate one, in the way that I've just described. And it puts an extreme burden onto you if you want to support the Kalam. Judging by what I've seen so far, you're probably going to try to dismiss it in some way, ignore it, shift the topic onto something unrelated, maybe at best take the universe to mean just the expansion of space-time as we know it. But I'll bet you ain't going to address it head on, because who does?
The simple response to this is to look at the scientific evidence. It is nearly universally accepted that the universe had a beginning. There have been certain theories like a collapsing universe, that the universe is sort of expanding and retracting on an infinite loop.
Yeah, I'm not referring to any of that. These are all insignificant details. What I'm referring to is the fact that there doesn't appear to be any evidence supporting the claim, which must be accepted for the Kalam cosmological argument to be accepted, that the entirety of physical reality has an origin, that there was some point where nothing physical existed at all. The simple response is to look at the scientific evidence, you say. Well, look at it then. There is no evidence for this claim. Zero. None.
But even today, these theories have been largely abandoned. If you believe in a timeless universe, you are doing so against the preponderance of scientific evidence.
Yeah, so I guess just repeat everything I said in that big long thing towards the start of the video. I pretty much covered this there.
Third and finally, people argue against the cosmological argument by stating it is not falsifiable. In science, a good solid experiment should have an experiment to show it's true and an experiment to show how it might be false.
An experiment should have an experiment and another experiment?
A good solid experiment should have an experiment to show it's true and an experiment to show how it might be false.
Okay. Seems a little convoluted, but man, you're opening up a real can of worms there in terms of philosophy of science. You need 2 experiments for everything, one for verification and one for falsification. I feel like you're asking to start a war with that.
Let's say you believe there are unicorns flying around in space.
Why do you persist with this? Cease.
And someone were to reasonably argue, well, there's no such thing as unicorns flying in space because there's no evidence to show one ever existed. To which they might respond, yeah, you might not be able to prove they do exist, but you can't prove they don't exist, so they might exist. This would be an example of a non-falsifiable argument.
I'd say that's a better example of shifting the burden of proof. Non-falsifiability is more about lacking testable predictions, the layering on of excuses for why it consistently is not detected. Like, hey, yeah, there's unicorns orbiting the Earth all over the place. Oh, really? Weird. I can't see any. Yeah, that's because they're invisible. And just generally like a severe lack of clarity about how you would go about showing that this thing is not true about reality. Which in fairness you did sort of hint at, and I would say a claim that there's a unicorn somewhere in space, for all practical purposes, is largely non-falsifiable. And if no clear criterion is provided or offered when asked for what would count as disproof that there is in fact a unicorn somewhere in space, yeah, it's an example of non-falsifiability. It's just the way you delivered it kind of muddled it up with the burden of proof aspect. That's all.
Since you cannot examine the entire universe for the presence of space unicorns, it would be impossible to prove or disprove this experiment.
You're trying to prove or disprove an experiment? What experiment? You didn't propose an experiment. You're talking about proving or disproving the claim.
Thereby making it a bit of a shaky claim. This argument has been popularized by the famous flying spaghetti monster.
I like the background colors. Excellent choices. But you're just giving a summary of the flying spaghetti monster and Russell's teapot and how these relate to unfalsifiability. I don't think I or my audience need the lesson, so we're just going to skip that.
Some people would say that because we cannot recreate the beginning of the universe, we cannot make a definitive claim that God created it.
I would say that's a foolish way to approach figuring things out. It's along the same lines as Ken Ham's "Were you there?" creationist stuff. The dismissal of so-called historical science. The inability to repeat the origin of the universe is definitely not a reason I would give for rejecting God belief. If it can be well justified in some other way, fair enough. I haven't seen it yet, but that doesn't mean I'm going to say it's impossible without witnessing the creation with my own eyes.
Since we can't observe the beginning of the universe, it would be impossible for us to say whether God did or did not do it. Therefore, it's a non-falsifiable argument and not a good argument.
I really don't see how this relates to the issue of falsifiability at all. It sounds more like a rejection of the validity of inference. I'll let you keep talking, maybe you clarify, but I really don't see the connection to this topic.
But this isn't actually true. The argument itself can be falsified. Let's show 3 different methods of disproving the cosmological argument. First, you could show that the universe itself is a non-contingent being. Second, you could show an example of an actual infinite regress. Or you could show the spontaneous existence of matter or energy without a cause.
Those are interesting, especially the third one. It's kind of fascinating that you try to put the burden of proof on other people to show that matter and energy can come into existence spontaneously from presumably nothing, when you haven't even shown that it's possible for energy to not exist in the first place. It's like you're placing your view as the default, even though there's no apparent sign that reality works that way, and everybody else has to catch up to you. As for the universe being non-contingent, well, I'll do the same thing that you do. It just is non-contingent. That's part of the definition of what it is. If you say that it's not, that's just you misunderstanding the concept. Universe means everything. All things, including the non-contingent. How can the thing containing that which is not contingent be itself contingent? See, you're not the only one capable of this childishness. I can descend to your level and place myself on equal footing. It'd just be nice if I didn't have to. Oh, and as for infinite regress, this always comes up, but the idea of a chronological infinite regress is based on intuitive ideas about time that really do not apply in the context we're talking about, and they don't make a whole lot of sense in the context of modern physics. Time is not a relevant factor before the Big Bang. So when people talk about what causes the universe, they're not necessarily talking about something based in time, the same way you're not. That doesn't mean that a physical concept is equivalent to the God concept. It just means that time is similarly inapplicable in both cases. Having said that, though, I think a lot of the objections to the idea of infinite regress are very intuitive, make a lot of sense from the human perspective, and as such are a little bit suspect even just on that basis, because reality is weird. The past century, more than a century, has really driven that point home. So it might well be weird enough that such a thing would be possible, in the same way that it might be weird enough that the universe really is actually infinite in scale, even though that doesn't seem possible, intuitively. Yeah, it's very unintuitive, but lots of things in reality seem to be unintuitive. Reality doesn't seem to be made to fit the human intuition. It's not really trying to pander to us. And this is another way in which these arguments jump the gun in terms of human understanding. You don't have the level of understanding required to be making these kind of arguments and have them actually be meaningful, for you to be justifiably very confident in thinking they tell you something about reality. But yeah, that's not to say I believe that there is an infinite regress in time. I don't believe that. In fact, like you, I would expect some sort of evidence of that before I believed it. That's entirely reasonable. The difference is just I apply that to other stuff too, and understand that I just don't have the information to embrace any particular view here with a good chance of actually being right. This is another one of those situations where you're perfectly fine to accept certain properties or possibilities when applied to God, like timeless causation, but then for your own convenience you deny the same thing when it's applied to anything else. Well, sorry, we're not playing that game. He goes on talking about these 3 points for like over a minute. He doesn't say anything I haven't already addressed, so I'm just going to skip that, get to the point.
As of yet, no one has been able to refute the cosmological argument, thereby showing the cosmological argument can be disproven, it has just not been disproven.
By which he means showing contradictory scientific evidence, but of course, this scientific falsification that we're talking about applies to claims. You would show that the argument is unsound, and one way to do that would be to show that one of the premises is unsupported, or at least inadequately supported. There's no need to show the conclusion to be false, or even the reasoning itself to be invalid. It's more than enough to show that one of the premises upon which the conclusion rests is inadequately supported, and for reasons that I think are clear based on what I've said so far in this video, that's how I see premise 2 when it's understood in the way that I explained earlier, which I think is the way that you have to see it if this argument is going to be effective in its goal. If all we take it to mean is that expansion started for some reason, sure, the physical something that was there at the start started to expand for most likely some physical reason. But again, like I explained, that's really missing the point of the entire argument. And in fact, I don't even think premise 1 is supported. By begin to exist, it doesn't mean the transmutation of existing stuff. That wouldn't be sufficient to make this a theistic argument. For that, it needs to mean beginning from nothing, in line with creation ex nihilo. Otherwise, it's just physical stuff doing physical stuff. Not beginning at all, except in the label-y kind of way humans use that word, where at some point during woodworking, we label the wood as having begun to be a chair now. No, it has to refer to a true, genuine beginning. The physical essence of the universe at the most fundamental level, whatever that might be, began to exist when previously it did not. Such a thing has never been observed. There's no indication that such a thing is possible. There's nothing to show us that this intuition is in any way reflective of fundamental reality. It's just purely made up. There's not even a reason for it. It's just taken as obvious truth, which it's not. So I reject both premises of this argument that are supposed to get us to the conclusion. I can't falsify the conclusion, and I don't care to. It's simply not required. The argument does not compel me to accept the conclusion. That's the end of the story. And of course, the conclusion, even if the universe is taken to refer to all of physical reality, is simply the universe being caused by something non-physical, which doesn't mean God. Now, I know William Lane Craig tacks on a bunch of other stuff to try to get to God after this, and frankly, in my opinion, the part of the argument we've been looking at today is significantly better than that stuff, which tells you a lot about my opinion of it, but that's a story for some other day. The overall point of this video is, look, if you're satisfied with this argument and however you've interpreted it, which you didn't really fully specify, but if you're good with that, that's wonderful for you. I wish you all the best, but I'm sorry, it just doesn't do it for me. Not when I hear it in the first place, and not when I hear your responses to the objections, either. There are too many weaknesses, too many assumptions, too much vagueness. It requires looking at the universe in this very particular way that I just don't think I have the information to do yet. And in the end, even if I accept all of it, even in the terms that I laid out towards the start of the video, as far as I'm concerned, linking the argument to God requires essentially just jamming him in the gap. And your video hasn't addressed any of my issues, so my position remains unchanged here at the end.
There's a lot of fun and interesting conversations to be had about the cosmological argument.
Another claim I don't believe.
And when entered into in good faith, it can provide solid evidence for a creator.
Okay, if that's your opinion, that's fine, I guess.
While there are some great objections, the more you study the word and the worlds around you, you begin to see the stronger the evidence for a creator God.
While there are some great objections to the Kalam cosmological argument, if you study the Bible and look at the trees, you'll find some good evidence for God. Okay, so I should just do a different thing than the thing we've been talking about? Was that as much of a non sequitur as it felt like?
But remember to do as the Bible says and to share these reasons with gentleness and respect.
No, the grumpy, aggressive Christians are way more fun. The soft stuff is kind of irritating.
So, do the arguments damage the cosmological argument, or do they provide further evidence for the existence of God? I don't know, but you decide.
So is the problem that you want your hands to be in frame, but you put the camera too high? Or why else do you keep lifting your hands up like they're a pair of antennae? Very confusing presentation on this video, but anyway, thank you everybody for watching. If you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't, and if you like the channel, maybe consider supporting. A few bucks a month helps a huge amount, and enormous thanks to all of my supporters who've already made that choice. Early access, email list, list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.